All right, so today we're diving into something that I think a lot of businesses are curious about these days, and that's employee GPS tracking.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's one of those things where it seems like it should be simple on the surface, right? Like,
Okay.
okay, can I track my employees or not?
Exactly.
But there are so many laws, especially here in the U.S., that it gets complicated quickly.
Absolutely. And, it's not just about like those big trucks you see on the highway anymore.
Yeah.
It's company cars, smartphones, even things like those fitness trackers that some people use for work.
Oh, yeah.
So much new tech means a lot of new legal questions.
Exactly, and that is why we are taking a deep dive into this TimeTrex guide, employee GPS tracking laws in the U.S.
It's a good thing we have the 2024 update too,
Yes.
because things are changing so fast.
So before we really get into the weeds, can you give us the big picture overview of the legal side of things?
Well, the biggest thing to remember is that there is not like a single federal law that says yes or no to GPS tracking for your employees.
Ah,
It's actually a few different laws,
okay.
like the Electronic Communications Privacy Act or the ECPA.
Okay, pause right there for a second.
Sure.
For those of us who don't speak lawyer,
Right.
what does that even mean?
Okay, so imagine the ECPA is the rule book for how companies can access and use anything electronic. So emails, phone records, and yeah, even location data from GPS.
Okay.
But that's not the only one.
Oh, no.
We also have the Stored Communications Act, and even the Fourth Amendment comes into play.
Wow.
Yeah, it's complicated.
So it's a lot of legal ground to cover. But I think what might make this even more interesting, even a little scary for some business owners, is how different the laws are depending on what state you're in.
Definitely.
And I got a sneak peek at the breakdown from TimeTrex, and let me tell you, there are some surprises in there.
Oh, yeah. You're definitely going to want to pay attention to this because what works in one state might get you in huge trouble in another.
Yeah, like California.
Oh, yeah.
They're really strict.
They are?
Like you need explicit consent to track location, even if it's a company device.
Yeah, California really wants to protect employees' privacy.
For sure. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Nevada
Right.
with this whole new law, Assembly Bill 356, where
Right.
if you track someone without their consent, you could be in some seriously hot water.
Yeah, like felony charges.
Oh.
So if you're a business owner in Nevada and you decide to track your employee's personal car when they're off the clock, just to, make sure they're being honest about their hours, you could be facing some huge fines.
Yeah, that's wild. But here's where I think it gets really tricky.
Okay.
There are a bunch of states
Yeah.
that haven't updated their laws to say anything specific about employee GPS tracking.
I see what you mean.
But that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want.
Right.
They might have really strict anti-stalking laws that could apply.
It's a minefield out there.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you can't just assume that because your main office is in a state with more relaxed laws, that you're in the clear.
Exactly.
You need to know the laws for every single state where your employees are working.
100%. You've got to do your research.
Okay, so let's say you've done your homework. You've got a legal team on speed dial and, all the different laws up and down.
Okay.
What's the most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to GPS tracking and staying on the right side of the law?
Consent. That's the golden rule.
All right, consent. I love it.
Yeah.
But it's not always as easy as just getting a signature on a form, right?
Right.
Like TimeTrex even have a whole section in here about all the little details.
Yeah.
Like they ask, can I track personal devices versus company devices differently?
And that's a really important question because there's a different expectation of privacy when it comes to personal devices. Like,
Right.
say an employee is using their personal cell phone for work calls and checking emails.
Okay.
That doesn't automatically mean you have the right to track their every move.
So even if it's technically legal in your state, trying to track an employee's personal phone without them knowing could still land you in some hot water.
Exactly. You're better off being upfront and getting their consent.
Makes sense.
It's better to be safe than sorry.
Totally. Now, with company-owned devices, it sounds like you have a bit more flexibility.
You do have a little more leeway, yeah, but you still need to have a really clear written policy about GPS tracking.
Yeah.
And don't bury it in some huge employee handbook. Nobody's going to read that.
Right.
Make sure your employees understand exactly what is being tracked, why it's being tracked, and how that data is going to be used.
So even if you're following the letter of the law, being open about it with your employees can go a long way.
Definitely, it shows that you respect them.
And that you're not trying to pull a fast one.
Right. You're treating them like adults.
Exactly. Okay, so we talked about consent and transparency, but besides checking those boxes, what are some other ways businesses can use GPS tracking responsibly? Without accidentally turning their workplace into a scene from 1984.
That's where things like geofencing come into play. It's a real useful tool because it lets you set those virtual boundaries for tracking.
Oh, I love geofencing.
Yeah.
It's like setting up an invisible fence around work areas. So you're not tracking every single movement an employee makes, just what happens within those designated zones. No more accidentally monitoring someone's midnight snack run, right?
Exactly. And you can even get even fancier with it. Like some technologies can automatically turn tracking on or off based on whether the employee is clocked in or not.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
Yeah, takes the guesswork out of it.
And speaking of being proactive, the TimeTrex guide also mentions that the technology itself can make a difference. Like choosing a system with strong privacy features built in.
For sure. You want to make sure you're using a system that lets you customize those tracking parameters so you can control exactly what data is being collected and who has access to it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and some systems even use data encryption to protect that information.
Okay, hold on. For those of us who aren't tech wizards, what does data encryption actually mean?
So imagine your data is like a postcard being sent through the mail. Anyone could potentially read that postcard, right?
Yeah.
But if you put that message in a sealed envelope that's like data encryption, only the intended recipient with the right key can open it and see what's inside.
Okay, that makes a
Yeah.
lot more sense. So it's like an extra layer of security to keep that sensitive data safe.
Exactly. And all of this plays into a bigger point about GPS tracking. It's not just about the technology itself. It's about using it in a way that respects your employees and builds trust.
Right. It's like you said earlier, transparency is key. Employees are much more likely to be on board with GPS tracking if they understand how it works, why it's being used, and what measures are in place to protect their privacy.
100%.
Yeah.
It's about open communication and creating a culture of respect. And that includes being prepared to address any concerns employees might have head on.
Because, let's be real, even with the best intentions, some employees are still going to be a little freaked out by the idea of GPS tracking,
Right.
right? They might worry about their boss constantly looking over their shoulder or their data being misused.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it's important to validate those concerns. Don't dismiss them as being paranoid or over the top. Remember, we're talking about people's sense of privacy and autonomy here.
Right. Like, what if my boss thinks I'm slacking off because I took a longer lunch break? Or what if this data is used against me somehow? It's easy to see how those fears could pop up.
Exactly. So the best thing you can do is address those fears directly. Remind employees of the company's commitment to data privacy and explain how the information will and won't be used. You can even offer to show them examples of their own tracking data. Sometimes seeing it firsthand can be reassuring.
And having those answers ready to go, like in an FAQ document or something, can make all the difference. It shows employees that you've actually thought about these issues and you're taking them seriously.
Right. It shows that you're not trying to hide anything. And
Yeah.
that transparency builds trust.
So it's about striking that balance between using technology to improve your business while also being mindful of the human impact.
Exactly. And that's a great segue into another important aspect of this whole conversation. We've talked a lot about the potential downsides of GPS tracking, but let's not forget that it can also have some real benefits for both businesses and employees.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's talk about the silver linings. What kind of perks are we talking about here?
Well, for businesses, GPS tracking can provide valuable data that can be used to make smarter decisions about things like resource allocation, performance evaluations, even customer service.
So, for example, you could use that data to figure out the most efficient delivery routes or see how your field teams are performing in real time.
Precisely. And that translates to cost savings, improved productivity, and happier customers. And those benefits can trickle down to employees as well.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. How so?
Well, if GPS tracking helps a company save money on fuel costs or reduce overtime hours, those savings could be passed along to employees in the form of bonuses or other incentives.
So it's not necessarily an us versus them situation. It can be a win-win if it's done right.
Exactly. And it all comes back to those core principles we've been discussing: transparency, consent, and a genuine commitment to using this technology responsibly.
It sounds so simple when you put it like that. But I know from experience that putting it into practice can be a whole other ballgame. So as a business owner, how do you actually create that culture of trust and transparency? What are some concrete steps you can take to make sure GPS tracking is seen as a tool that benefits everyone, not just a way to keep tabs on employees?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But I think it all boils down to treating your employees like stakeholders in this process, not just data points on a map.
I love that stakeholders, not data points. Okay, I'm sold. But what does that look like in the real world?
It starts with involving your employees in the decision-making process early on. Don't just spring a new GPS tracking policy on them out of nowhere. That's a recipe for disaster.
Because no one likes to feel like they're being spied on without their knowledge or consent.
Exactly. Instead, have open and honest conversations with your employees about why you're considering GPS tracking, what the potential benefits are, and what steps you'll be taking to protect their privacy.
And those conversations shouldn't be a one-time thing, right? It needs to be an ongoing dialogue.
Absolutely. Make it clear that you're open to feedback and willing to make adjustments as needed. It's about building that trust and showing employees that their voices are heard.
And that their opinions actually matter.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to do that is to give employees a genuine say in how the technology is implemented.
So instead of just handing them a policy and saying take it or leave it, you're actually involving them in shaping the rules themselves.
Precisely. Let's say you're thinking about implementing geofencing. Don't just draw those virtual boundaries on your own. Get input from your employees. Ask them, what makes sense for your role? Where do you feel like those lines should be drawn?
Because they're the ones who are actually out there doing the work. They know the ins and outs of their jobs better than anyone.
Exactly. And through those conversations, you might discover that different roles or departments have different needs and concerns when it comes to GPS tracking.
So one-size-fits-all approach might not be the best strategy.
You got it. You might decide that certain employees, like those working in high-risk environments, require more comprehensive tracking for safety reasons, while others might only need minimal tracking for things like timekeeping or mileage reimbursement.
It's about finding that balance between what's necessary for the business and what's reasonable for the employee.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of responsible GPS tracking: data security. When you're dealing with sensitive information like employee locations, you need to make sure you're taking every precaution to protect that data from unauthorized access or misuse.
Okay, let's talk data security. What are some of the key things businesses should be thinking about?
Well, for starters, you want to make sure you're choosing a GPS tracking system from a reputable vendor with a strong track record of data security. Look for things like end-to-end encryption, remember our sealed envelope, two-factor authentication, and regular security audits.
So basically all the same things you'd look for when choosing any other type of sensitive business software.
Exactly. Don't skimp on security just because it's just GPS data. That data can be incredibly revealing, and it's crucial to treat it with the same level of care you would any other confidential information.
And I imagine that level of care extends beyond just the technology itself. You also need to have clear policies and procedures in place for things like data access, storage, and disposal.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just have a secure system. You also need to make sure the right people have access to the data and that it's being stored and disposed of in a secure and compliant manner. That means having clear guidelines for things like who can access the data, what can they use it for, how long is it stored, and how is it disposed of when it's no longer needed.
So it's a multi-pronged approach to data security. Choosing the right technology, implementing robust policies and procedures, and fostering a culture of security awareness among your employees.
Exactly. Because even the most secure system in the world can be compromised if employees aren't trained on things like password hygiene, phishing spams, and the importance of reporting suspicious activity.
Right, so that whole human firewall concept. Technology can only take you so far. You also need to educate your team on how to be smart about data security.
100%. And that education should be ongoing. Don't just do one training session and call it a day. Regularly reinforce those security best practices, share information about new threats, and make sure employees know how to report any potential issues.
It's about creating that culture of security awareness from the top down.
Exactly. And when you combine that culture with strong technology and robust policies, you're well on your way to implementing GPS tracking in a way that's both effective and responsible.
So we've covered a ton of ground here today. Everything from the legal ins and outs to the technology itself, and even how GPS tracking can impact your company culture.
It's definitely a lot to think about, but that's the thing about GPS tracking. It's not a decision you can just make overnight.
Not at all. But as we've been saying, when it's handled correctly, GPS tracking has the potential to benefit both businesses and their employees.
I completely agree. It all comes back to finding that balance. Using tech to improve your business, but also making sure your employees feel respected and heard throughout the process.
Okay, so let's say you're listening to this right now and thinking, all right, I need to figure this out for my company. What's the most important piece of advice you can give?
That's a great question. I would say, don't just ask yourself, can I legally track my employees' locations? Ask yourself, should I?
Oh, I like that. Because it's easy to get caught up in what's allowed,
Yeah.
but this is about more than just checking boxes, right?
Right. Just because you have the ability to track every move your employees make doesn't mean you should. Think about it. Is this level of tracking truly essential to your business? Will it actually improve things, or will it just make everyone feel like they're being watched all the time?
And nobody wants to feel like Big Brother is looking over their shoulder 24/7.
Exactly. That's why those open conversations and building trust with your team is so crucial. When employees understand why you're using GPS tracking and they feel like they have a voice in the process, they're much more likely to be on board.
It's about using this technology as a tool to work together, not as a weapon against your employees.
100%. When it's done ethically and responsibly, GPS tracking can be a win-win situation. It can improve safety, increase efficiency, and even lead to happier customers and employees.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you today.
Likewise, for everyone listening out there, remember, knowledge is power, but use it wisely.
And don't be afraid to reach out to a legal expert if you have any questions or concerns.
Couldn't agree more. Until next time, everybody.